Okay. I think we can start. So this is our second and last keynote talk for this year, which is concluding our today's conference. And we are particularly grateful to have today Hessel Osterbik. First of all, not only because he stepped in 2 months ago when Philip Oreopoulos told us that he could not make it. So thanks a lot for that. But also because since 2010, Hessel has been a strong supporter, friends of our conference. He was one of the keynote speakers in our inaugural edition in 2010. Actually, it was the first ever keynote talk of Iwaee. And since then, Hessel supported our conference, a member of the scientific committee, is evaluating for us a few papers each year, and I have to say that you are always the first sending us the reports. Very efficient, very quick. So for those who don't know Hessel, very few I think, he's a professor at the University Professor of Economics, Amsterdam University. His research interests are in the broad area of human capital, especially in education, health, labor, and he has extensively published in top economic journal. And I just mentioning some in the last 10 years after your first talk at Iwaee, we can say 2 QJ, one on long-term effects of class size, then economic journal, this is just in education, and another journal of human resources on parental response to public investment in children, then review economic studies on peer effects, randomized experiment, and I think forthcoming Journal of Public Economics on preference heterogeneity and school segregation. And today you are giving a talk on school assignment, segregation, and outcomes. Thank you. You have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. So the talk today is about school assignment, segregation, and outcomes, which is kind of basically bringing recent work that I've been working on together. So it's talking about a couple of different papers. So the setting that I have in mind is that many cities operate public school systems where students can choose among different schools. And then some schools will be more popular than other schools and may have, end up being oversubscribed. And then an important issue is how to assign the seats that are in high demand. And kind of the traditional approach is to respect the sovereignty of consumers. So have students' preferences reign this. And that is the approach in the school assignment literature, and I'll talk about that approach first. But of course, there can also be other political goals like the city that is operating the school system might be interested in desegregation. And a final approach could be based on student outcomes, and I'll also talk about that possibility. So the first paper that I want to talk about is the paper together with Monique de Haan, Pieter Coutier, and Bas van der Klauw. It's like the paper started a bit longer ago, but we are currently revising this. So this paper addresses or gets into this traditional school assignment literature. And let me briefly explain this, because this is a bit of a separate subfield in the economics of education. So there's this large theoretical literature that analyzes the properties of school assignment mechanisms. And basically the key choice is between the deferred acceptance mechanism and the immediate acceptance mechanism, also known as Boston. So it's kind of the choice that school districts have. The deferred acceptance mechanism has some nice properties. It's strategy proof and it results in a stable allocation. The Boston mechanism does not have these two desirable properties, but instead it has the property that it allows students to express the intensity of their preferences to some extent. And as a result of that, it may dominate the deferred acceptance mechanism in terms of the mean welfare of the students. So like it's in a sense an empirical issue whether that gain whether that gain in mean student welfare materializes and whether that is big enough to kind of not have these other two properties that are desirable. So let me briefly explain how these mechanisms work. So the Boston mechanism is the mechanism where students submit an ordered list of schools. Schools rank students on the basis of priorities, for instance, having an older sibling in the school, and then there's a lottery that gives a strict priority to students that are in the same priority group. And then in round one, students are assigned to their number one school, but schools that have more applicants than seats, they reject the lowest ranked students. So these students are rejected. They go then in the next round to the next school of their list, if that school has still remaining places. And if more students apply to that number two school, then it also again rejects the lowest ranked students until all the students are placed. So this is thinking in terms of a system where there's enough places in total to seat all the students. So this is the Boston mechanism that is in use in many places, and this is the mechanism where it's not necessarily good to report your true preferences, and the reason for that is that like if you do that, so you apply to a very popular school, then you take in some sense a risk because your number two school might then kind of also be oversubscribed, but to a lesser extent, but you forgo the possibility to be placed there. And then you go down to your list. So it might be better if your kind of utility difference between your number one and two is not so big, to strategically opt for your number two school. So that is the Boston mechanism. And then the deferred acceptance mechanism, it works kind of, it looks very similar. Students submit again a list of schools. Schools again rank students. And in round one, students are assigned to the number one school, but they are now not immediately assigned to that school. They are only tentatively assigned to that school. And the schools that are oversubscribed reject their lowest ranked students. And then in the next round, the students that were rejected at their number one school, they are considered for their number two school, even if that number two school was already kind of in the first round completely filled up, because it's not filled up with students that are definitely placed there. They are only tentatively placed there, and that implies that a student in a second round can kind of be assigned to a school that she ranks second and takes the place of a student that ranked that school first, if that student has higher priority there or has a better lottery number at that school. And so this feature of the deferred acceptance mechanism makes that it's in students' best interest to report their true preferences. You never run the risk of foregoing your possibilities at your number two school by ranking another school first. And again, this process continues till all the students are placed somewhere. So there's kind of an important difference between two types of this deferred acceptance mechanism, that is between what they call single tie breaking and multiple tie breaking. In single tie breaking, students have one lottery number, that's your lottery number in each and every school, whereas with multiple tie breaking, you have different lotteries numbers at different schools. I'll get back to that at a later point. So just to illustrate, so we have here a very simple world with only 3 students, A, B, C, and 3 schools, school 1, school 2, school 3. The students completely agree with the ordinal ranking of these schools. 1 is better than 2, and 2 is better than 3. And here we see the kind of the cardinal utilities of the students. And so all the students value school 1 at 100. Students A and B value the next schools at 60 and 50. And students C value schools 2 and 3 at 80 and 0. Well, if the students now report their true preferences as they do in their best interest in the deferred acceptance mechanism, then all the students have, if there's no priorities here, then they have all 1/3 chance to get in any of these schools. So students A and B have an expected utility of 70, and student C has an expected utility of 60. If now instead we would not have deferred acceptance, but would have the Boston mechanism in place, then student C might realize that it's optimal for her to switch immediately to school 2 and then secure the place at school 2 and get an expected utility, which is basically a certain utility then of 80, and leave kind of the fight for the place at school 1 between A and B, who then both have a 50% probability of being placed there and 50% of ending up in school 3, because they are not considered in the second round in school 2 anymore. And so then they both have an expected utility of 75. And this is an example where we see that everyone is better off in expected utility terms by switching from deferred Boston mechanism. So this is kind of the motivation why this Boston mechanism might still be better. But it's important to realize here that this requires quite some sophistication from the students, especially from student C, who has to kind of realize that if she applies to school 2 instead of school 1, that she has will be certainly placed there. So that also requires knowledge about what other students value and what they will do. So optimal strategic play under Boston is not easy, and so it's in the end an empirical question whether students will be sophisticated enough to do this optimally. The existing empirical literature tends to point in that direction. So there's these couple of papers by Iwaee, by Katerina Calsamiglia and co-authors, and by Agarwal and Somaini, who all use data from a system where students apply under kind of a Boston type mechanism, and then they apply a structural demand framework to uncover or to recover from the choices that they observe the true preferences of students. And in each of these cases, of these papers, what the conclusion is that students are better off under the Boston mechanism than under the deferred acceptance mechanism. But this, the estimation of these structural demand models, this requires is that the authors have to make some untested assumptions about students' beliefs, about the admission probabilities. They kind of basically have to know what the admission probabilities are, and this requires that they know where other students are going to apply. And it requires that, given these admission probabilities, they kind of make no mistakes. So if you are willing to doubt this, and that is basically what we did, then you have to kind of get additional information from somewhere. And the approach that we followed was to complement the application procedure of students choosing a secondary school in Amsterdam in 2013 with a survey. And in the survey, and students in Amsterdam applied under like a version of the Boston mechanism. We sent these students this survey where they had to rank up to 10 schools in order of their true preferences. And moreover, we asked students to award points to each of these schools. Each of the schools that they listed, the top one was then like 100 points, and the other schools had to be ranked, had to be awarded points relative to this 100. This is, of course, in some sense, a naive approach, because it asks students to report this kind of truthfully, and we don't pay them for this. This is just assuming that they report this in a useful way. We kind of made explicit that whatever they would report in that survey was not going to affect the actual placement, the information was not shared with the school, but was directly sent to us. So that's the approach, and like what this then results in is that we get from all the students that participate in this secondary school match, we get a list like this, an ordered preference list of the schools. Here is a student that ranks 6 schools, and then that also reports the points, which is then what we are going to use as a measure of the intensity of their preferences. Of course, it's like preference points is not like a very well-known or common measure of preferences. It's what we came up with after discussions and thinking, what is reasonable for people to kind of be able to report. And we have considered alternatives, and we have also in other settings tried alternatives, but we kind of think that this is still probably the best that we can do. So to give an indication of what a point means, we regressed like the preference points that students give to each of these schools on the home school distance that we measure, and then with school fixed effects and school fixed effects, and then turns out that 1 point is equivalent to 340 meters, which is something that we kind of, it's good to keep that in mind for later purposes. So the data that we use, so we focus on the academic track, which is the track where most of the competition for places in popular school takes place. So it's around 25% of the students. In the year that we have data of, it was almost 2,000 students who could apply to 28 schools that offer that track in Amsterdam. 5 schools in that year were oversubscribed in the first round, and then 80 students lost the lottery. So that kind of looks like a small number of students that lost the lottery relative to this almost 2,000 that are participating. But like if you see the number of students that apply to one of these oversubscribed schools, then this affects almost 40% of the students that are kind of exposed to the risk of a lottery. 64% of the students in this track responded to the survey, and we extensively experimented with how to deal with non-response, and like the results that I'm going to present, they are not sensitive to how we exactly do this. So one important issue is then first, like how many, what share of the students engage in strategic behavior, and that is like we see that from them reporting another school on the number one place of the survey, than the school where they actually applied to. And then we see that that's true for 6% of the students, which is a small share, but that also makes sense given that the placement probabilities in popular school are still I run the risk of losing a lottery, but the probability of winning the lottery is still 80%. So only if the difference in valuation between your number one and your number two school is not so big, it would make sense to make strategic choice. We see that this does not differ along the lines of the parental background. There's some difference in like the share of students that choose strategically by the score of their score on the exit test from primary school. So this is all students that qualify for the academic track, so which is the highest 25%, but within that we still distinguish between low, medium, and high, where low is low within that group, but not low in the more general population. Important result is also here below, where we see that if we split the sample by what is the difference that they report in preference points between the number one and number two school, that we see that the share of students that choose strategically is larger in the group where this difference is small, which makes sense, and which is then also exactly going in the direction where the Boston mechanism potentially outperforms the deferred acceptance mechanism in terms of welfare. So here it's the student that has a good number two alternative that is basically making way for the student that has a higher intensity in utility terms for the number one school. Now, there's a question where the test scores are taken into account by the lottery. They are not, no. So the lottery is really like a lottery. So this compares the two mechanisms, or actually it compares three mechanisms. So what this shows is different measures of the allocation, the share of students that is placed in their top ranked school under the Boston mechanism, that's 89%. The share that is placed in their top three, that's 98%. And then we see there the mean preference points, which is 96.5. So that is under the Boston mechanism, and then we see the differences when we would move from the Boston mechanism to the deferred acceptance mechanism with single tie breaking or with multiple tie breaking. And then so we gain 1 percentage points placed in the top ranked school if we move to single tie breaking, and we lose 1 percentage points if we would move to multiple tie breaking. Looking at share of students placed in their number one, then in both cases we would gain 1%. Here we also report the share of winners and losers in expected utility terms, and this is like averaged over many draws of lottery numbers. And then there's it's clear that moving to deferred acceptance will there's a substantial share of winners, but there's also a substantial share of losers. So basically saying the move from one mechanism to the other mechanism will never be like a Pareto improvement as like only making people better off. So if you look at what we find in terms of mean preference points, then we see that there is a 1/2 point gain in utility when we go from Boston to deferred acceptance, and it doesn't matter so much whether that is with a single tie breaking or with multiple tie breaking. So how much is 1/2 point? 1/2 point is like half of 340 meters. So that is like the average distance to home school distance. 1/2 point looks perhaps like a small number if we compare that to the 96.5 that we realize on average. But if we compare the 1/2 point to the 3.44 points that is between the 100 that we have if everyone is placed in his top choice and the 96.5 that we have here. So this 3.5 points loss compared to everyone in his top place. That's where all the fuss is about, like that parents are kind of nervous about. Well, will my child? What am I going to do in this school match? And so then, like 1/2 point gain compared to that 3.5 point loss is still kind of substantial. Kind of important is, of course, that what we find is on average a gain in mean welfare, whereas theory predicts a loss, and also previous studies kind of point to a loss. So what is the cause of this? So we consider 3 explanations, whether this is due to the cardinal utility measure that we use, whether this is something to do with the structure of supply and demand of schools in Amsterdam, or whether this is due to mistakes that students make because playing this Boston mechanism is potentially difficult. If we don't use our preference points, but if we use estimates from a rank-ordered Logit model, which we have estimated on the ranking of schools that students report in the survey. So we kind of ignore the points that they report, but we keep the order. Then if we use that data to estimate the rank-ordered Logit model, and from that kind of produce utility levels for different schools, then we also see that there's a gain in moving from Boston to deferred acceptance. So it's so the gain is smaller. Like if we would translate that into distance equivalence, but that's probably due to like something like in the Logit specification. It makes it very difficult to kind of find substantial differences in utility levels at top choices in a rank-ordered Logit model. In terms of the sign of the change, that is consistent what we find with the preference points. If we then move to applying a structural demand model to our data, which is basically mimicking what the other studies have done. So we completely ignore the information from the survey, but just look at the choice data. What we then see is that going from Boston to deferred acceptance leads to a loss in mean welfare. So in that sense, if we do that, basically the results are consistent with what those studies find, which is basically indicating that whatever we find is not due to something that is specific in the structure of demand and supply in Amsterdam. So then we move to the third possible explanation that we have, or that we can think of, and that is that this is due to mistakes that students make under the Boston mechanism. So this is kind of what we had before. So for the full sample, but now restricted to the sample of only the respondents, and not kind of weighing this up by imputing for non-respondents. If we now exclude all the students that make mistakes, then we see that, basically, and a mistake is an individual mistake. So this is, I could have done better given what all the other students do. So if we exclude those students, then we get kind of the opposite conclusion. And if we exclude the students that make a mistake, and of the students that were kind of revealed strategic, so the students that made a strategic mistake or that made a strategic choice, and of those we drop the students that make a mistake, then we again have the same conclusion. Basically reversing the conclusion that we will draw. It's very important that kind of to permit for the conclusion to basically allow for the possibility that students make mistakes because they do, and that has substantial consequences for welfare. So this is considering like individual mistakes, but we can of course also kind of do the exercise of having all the students playing Boston optimally together, so jointly optimal. So that's also what we can do. So if all the students play Boston optimally, then we end up with an average welfare of 97, or average preference points of 97.1. If you go from that to deferred acceptance, then we lose 0.04. So we only lose then basically 1/10 of what we gain if we go from actual Boston to deferred acceptance. So going from actual Boston to deferred acceptance, we gain 0.5 point. Going from deferred acceptance to optimal Boston, no one makes a mistake, and like jointly optimal, we only gain other 0.04 points. Basically meaning that the 90% of the gap between actual Boston and optimal Boston is bridged by using the deferred acceptance mechanism. We see that this is kind of similar for boys and girls. We also see that this is similar for disadvantaged and non-disadvantaged students. What we see is that there's kind of this distinct effects for students from with a lower test score. So they are basically the ones that lose the most by going from optimal Boston to deferred acceptance, but they are also the ones that kind of gain, they have the lowest mean utility level under the optimal Boston mechanism. So to conclude this part is that switching from actual mistake-prone Boston to optimal Boston results in a mean welfare gain of 0.54 preference points, and 90% of this gain is obtained by switching from actual Boston to deferred acceptance. So one paper that I didn't mention yet till now, but which is kind of engaging in a kind of a similar exercise is this paper by Kapoor and co-authors. And they also reach kind of a similar conclusion, but instead, so the difference in the approach is that they do not collect data on students' preferences. Instead, they collect data on students' beliefs about admission probabilities. And then given these beliefs, they assume that they make optimal choices. And then this paper finds that there's like a substantial welfare loss under the Boston type mechanism that they study in their paper, because students are kind of wrong. Their beliefs about the admission probabilities are severely biased. So this is all kind of from this perspective that students or the parents know kind of which school they want, and like somehow we completely respect that. But of course, we can also have other views on who should go to school with whom, and there's this big literature on school segregation that we want to talk to. And in a recent paper with Sander Savako and Bas van der Klauw, we look at that. And basically what we use in that paper is that since 2015, the secondary schools in Amsterdam switched from the Boston mechanism to the deferred acceptance mechanism. And that means that each year all the participating students submit this extensive preference list, ranking as many schools as they want. And that is, of course, a very rich source of information about students' school preferences. So what we do is we use these lists to estimate how much of school segregation by ethnicity, and in the paper also by income, in secondary schools in Amsterdam can be attributed to residential sorting, and how much can be attributed to heterogeneous preferences. And basically our approach in that paper is to estimate rank-ordered logic models where the distaste for traveling and where the school fixed effects can differ between ethnic groups or can differ between income groups. And then we use these estimates to construct counterfactuals where we basically then impose that students from different groups are assumed to have homogeneous school preferences. So to give an impression about the extent of segregation by ethnicity in Amsterdam. So this is looking at ethnic segregation, where we distinguish between students with a non-Western migration background, which is kind of 50% of the student population in Amsterdam, and students with a Western background. So the segregation index that we probably all know is the dissimilarity index, basically saying how many students of the minority group have to change schools to kind of make completely undo segregation. And then for schools, like for school segregation at the school level or at the class level, that is 45 to 48%. That has to kind of move. If we compare that with residential segregation at the postal code, and that would split the city of Amsterdam in 70 different areas, then that is kind of very similar. So this is very suggestive that, school segregation, and we are talking secondary schools, and residential segregation are highly correlated, suggesting that school segregation is driven by residential segregation. So here we express the same segregation data in another index, the Mutual Information Index, which is also kind of ranging from 0 to 1, but which is based on measure of entropy. We use that measure because it's easy to decompose that measure, which is not true for the dissimilarity index. So basically, what we do is estimate this type of models, where we allow students of Western and non-Western descent to have different tastes for homeschool distances, and we allow them to have different kind of school fixed effects. And then we see that these school fixed effects are really different significantly. We can see that here where we plot where each dot is like a school fixed effect combination for the two groups at different levels of schooling, vocational, elementary, vocational theory, college and university level. And so these fixed effects, they are correlated, but they're clearly not perfectly correlated. And so students of different groups have different preferences for schools. And then if we do we construct the counterfactual with the homogeneous preferences, then basically this is the 0.23. That is the actual segregation measured in this mutual information index. So if we would just randomly assign, if we would just assign students to their tracks, and within tracks there's just one school, then that's basically close to half of the total segregation. So half of the total segregation is then due to students of different background going to different ability tracks. So that's an important component. But if we then kind of split the remainder into, there's just because schools are not so big, even if you randomly assign students to schools, there will be some segregation, but that accounts for very little. So it's a correction term, but it doesn't do a lot. And then if we impose that students of different groups have homogeneous preferences in terms of have the same school fixed effects, then that increases segregation a bit, but not so much, from this 0.099 to 0.119. So it does a bit, but not so much. Whereas the bigger part really comes from the students of different groups having different preferences. That kind of leads to this increase from 0.119 to 0.211. And that is also within each of these tracks, the bigger contribution. And then we see that between letting every student go to where they want to go, their first choice, or the actual placement, that does not do so much. So the important conclusion here is that it seems that much of the school segregation given the ability tracking is due to students of different groups having heterogeneous preferences. And that also probably limits very much the scope of policies to reduce this the segregation. So we kind of experimented with that in our data. And so this is then reporting segregation again in the dissimilarity index. So the 0.48 we have seen before. So then there would be two possible forms of affirmative action, having imposing minority quotas or minority reserves. So reserves, this basically gives priority to students of a minority group in a school. But if that student doesn't want that place, or a student of that group doesn't want that place, then I can still go to someone else. So that reduces segregation by just a small fraction, from 0.48 to 0.47. If we would use minority quota, which is basically saying, well, if the student from this minority group does not want a place, then that place remains empty. That does more, but that clearly comes at the cost of inefficiency. But because that really keeps places at some of the popular schools empty. So that this basically shows that it is not so easy to fight school segregation, because the preferences of students really go against that. So since these students since 2015 go through this system of deferred acceptance, and then are exposed to a lottery because there's not enough place for all the students at all the popular schools. There is kind of some randomness in the placement, given the preference lists that students submit. So in work that we are currently working on, we look at what is the importance or the unimportance of school assignment for student outcomes. So does it matter whether I get a place at my most preferred school, or if I get lower on a school on my list? And traditionally, we would probably be most interested in what does this do to traditional school outcomes? Do I get my diploma? What kind of grades do I get? But because parents are not only interested in those type of outcomes, but also in other things. Is my child happy in school, or does my child have friends in school? We basically decided to go to all the schools, and within all the schools go to all the classrooms and ask students to fill out a survey that we designed. So that's what we did, and we are currently in the stage of analyzing these data. So what I'm going to show now is kind of preliminary. That's important to be aware of. So the data are rich, but the data can we can kind of define treatment in different ways, because we can say what is the effect of being placed in my number one school versus not my number one school, or what like being placed in one school in my top three versus outside my top three, or even does it matter if I'm placed in a school with a large fraction of minority students or not? So there's different treatments. So for now, we concentrate on being placed in the most preferred school. Since the whole assignment procedure is by track, so the analysis is also by track. So here we concentrate on the results for the academic track. So this kind of shows something of characterizing the treatment. So how is the school different if I'm placed in my number one school instead of not my number one school? So that reduces the homeschool distance. It leads to if I'm in number one, then the rank of my school is 1. If I'm not in my number one, then the rank of my school is on average 3.8. And then 90, this is then the first stage are kind of, am I then in year one in my top one school? And then that first stage is not 1, but it's 0.92, because there's still 7% of students who lose the lottery at their number one school, but are still placed in their number one school when the school year starts. But that is due to there's always this reserves list. because the lottery takes place in May and the school starts in September. So there's some students moving, and so yeah, there's kind of some fraction of non-compliance. Then here we see like that this affects like who were your peers in the school. If I'm placed in my number one school, that is like a lower fraction of students who come from a household with below median income, fewer students from single parent households, higher test score result from primary school, and a higher percentage of Dutch students. So yeah, that is kind of showing what students kind of choose if they choose their number one, and what the difference is with lower ranked schools on their list, and if they're placed there. So this shows some results on academic progression, but I'm skipping that now because at some point this will of course be much more interesting if we have the exam results of students and see what they're going to do after secondary school. This I thought was kind of an interesting first result. So we asked students about their civic engagement by asking them to what extent they agree with certain statements. So the statement that people must listen carefully to each other even if they disagree, there's a significant effect. People who earn enough must take care of the people who are less fortunate. There's a significant effect. And I like to hang out with people who are different from me, for instance, with a different religion or culture. There's also a significant effect. And note that all these significant effects are significantly negative, kind of pointing to if I'm placed in my number one school, I score lower on these on my agreement with these statements, which is kind of suggesting that at the moment that people are kind of forced to not stay in their own cocon or in their own bubble, that kind of makes them score higher on these measures for civic engagement. And the only measure of civic engagement where kind of the students placed in their number one school score better is that they think that it's good that students strike for the climate. Final slide is like if we are interested in like happiness, satisfaction, and satisfaction with the school, satisfaction with life, then it doesn't seem that like being placed in your number one school has like an impact on that. Which is kind of reassuring for the parents of the children who were less fortunate in these lotteries. Still, the children realize that they would have rather attended another school. So there's still, but that percentage is 0.2, whereas like this should have been 0.1 if they have or should be -1. If they had this kind of, if this would be constantly with them, which is apparently not the case. This is it, what I wanted to share. I don't see any faces.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm here, at least, Hessel.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and I have the opportunity, if people want to ask questions, I'm just looking now. We have time for some questions. You have to raise your hand though as an attendee, or put something in Q&A for me to allow you to speak. Hans, okay. You should be right. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for a really nice talk. Really useful. On your first part on like making mistakes, I was just wondering whether you know of like settings or studies on like how we can get students not to make mistakes. I mean, it's just looking at my own data and also seeing from other settings, they often make mistakes. They don't understand the system and so on. And I don't know many studies like studying information treatments or what can we do to.
No, so yeah, I've like we went through all the surveys and see what type of mistakes they make, and say most students that make a mistake are students that were strategic and should not have been strategic. So yeah, probably then underestimating their placement probability at the popular school. But I think like an important result is then also that, say, even if none of the students would make a mistake jointly, that the gain that you would be able to make then relative to deferred acceptance is tiny.
Mm. Okay. Yeah. No, I was probably also No, thanks. That makes sense. I was also thinking about people just not understanding the system, but I mean, they might not make mistakes just because they don't understand.
Yeah.
The system.
Like at the time when that system was in place, so there also internet existed then, and so also then there were kind of these websites of organizations of parents that kind of were giving each other information about making people aware of the possibility that being strategic might be beneficial. So perhaps this was kind of making more students strategic than should have been the case.
Thanks.
Sorry, any more? I'll jump in. So I know you told us this, but I missed it. What remind me what the timing of this survey? I'm very interested in the civic engagement. So when are these kids relative to them getting their place being asked?
1 to 6 years later. So okay. we basically survey all the grades, and all of them have been through that system.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is over all these different grades.
So what you've on the slide before this, your underlying idea is that moving away from a local school is reducing civic engagement. Is that
no, that's not local school. There's only very few students in secondary schools in Amsterdam that go to the school that is closest to their house.
Okay. So that's what I'm trying to work out, is whether it's the effect of the reshuffling or the effect of these particular elite schools. So it's just that I've seen, this is a concern people have, for instance, with grammar schools in the UK, is that there's a treatment effect which is, let's say, based on a lot of pressure and also some changes in changing the attitudes of kids in particular ways. So I'm trying to work out what exactly you think we're picking up here.
Yeah, so here we have so we start now with working on a report for the schools in Amsterdam, and the schools in Amsterdam are primarily interested in does it matter where I'm placed in my number one school or not. So that's why we define the treatment as being placed in your number one school. What you are hinting at is more the distinction between would be probably single track academic schools in the Dutch context versus comprehensive schools. We haven't analyzed that, but I can imagine that these differences are even a bit larger if we would look at that kind of measure of the treatment. So here, this is basically saying, well, the students want to go to a certain school, perhaps with their friends, and they are kind of isolated, so they're a bit outside of their comfort zone. Yeah, and that makes them meet different types of people. That's my reading of this.
Oh, sure.
Also, we saw that before. They are then placed in schools where the share of students from a lower income family is larger. If they lose the lottery, so that makes sense then with this statement of being less fortunate. And perhaps also because they themselves realized that they were less fortunate at some point in their life.
Just clarification. You show the coefficient of minus 0.91 on first year top ranked school. So I didn't quite get how do you interpret that. So it's big effect because then you say that you had to add.
Which
was in the previous paper, I think. Minus the first year. Was 0.9, something like that.
Here.
Yes.
Yeah.
How do you interpret it? So it's big effect, this one. So because then you say that you have to add to the control mean, so it comes to 0.98.
Yeah. So but this is basically just saying that those that win the lottery are 92% more likely to be in the number one school than students that lose the lottery. So that's
just okay.
That's what this is saying.
And then there are 7% that you say that are really listed because they were in such a waiting list, something like that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
But yeah.
Okay. I don't see any more questions, so last opportunity. Otherwise, it always feels strange now in the online. We'd like to clap and everything, but thank you so much, Herschel, for the talk. Everyone else is muted, so I'm sure they're clapping in their offices somewhere.
Yeah.
It's been great to have you back again. We hope to get you physically to Catanzaro sometime in the future, and we hope. I'll just sign off by thanking everyone for the conference, their involvement, and to, of course, keep an eye out. Sometime in the near future, we'll start posting information on what we hope will be an in-person conference in 2022. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Looking forward to that. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks a lot.